Welcome, everyone. We have people joining us now, and it's wonderful to have people, so many people having registered for this event. I begin our webinar today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the place that I join you from today, where people have been meeting and talking for thousands of years. I pay my respects to those elders who are past, present and emerging for their custodianship of country, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island brothers and sisters who are here today. I also welcome the many custodians of lands and sea around the world. We know that we usually have friends joining from across the Pacific, many other nations. My name is Jazz Chambers, and together with my colleagues from Ocean Decade Australia, Dr. Lucy Buxton and Kate Pickard, we want to thank our presenters and contributors for their time and energy today in bringing their expertise and insight into this session. Before we begin, please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with everyone, as well as on Ocean Decade Australia's channels at the conclusion of today's session. We also welcome your questions, and we will have time for Q&A with our presenters. So please send in questions via the Q&A channel, not the chat channel, ideally, because that's where we'll be monitoring them, and we will do our best to get through them. Please note that this forum is intended to be a source of general information. So if you have specific questions, particularly commercially related questions, please feel free to contact our experts separately on that. You might expect an invoice as they are legal professionals and highly sought after. For those of you who are new to Ocean Decade Australia, we are a national not-for-profit leadership organisation focused on connecting Australia's ocean stakeholders through knowledge, networking, learning and advocacy, so that all together we can drive the conditions for a successful and sustainable blue economy and ocean sector. Part of our mission is to fill the gap when it comes to cross-sectoral dialogue, and we work collaboratively with industry specialists, colleagues and friends who are expert in areas across food, fishing, science, energy, resources, tourism, communications, shipping and infrastructure, and also law. In addition to our cross-sectoral approach, ODA plays a distinctive role by creating platforms and opportunities for the ocean to show up in places where it has not obviously been considered as a strategic imperative. And this is in broader business and boardroom discussions, ESG considerations, retail at large, banking and finance, and also connecting the dots across government. Before we begin today, it's important to acknowledge the broader context in which this event is taking place. Over the past year, and particularly since the start of 2026, serious questions have emerged about the strength of international law. As a result, there is a growing sense, both amongst the public and policymakers, that the rules-based international order may be under strain or even in decline. And it is in that context that today's discussion is so important. While there is genuine cause for celebration of the BBNJ Agreement, its adoption and its progress towards entry into force and Australia's ratification, we must also recognise that public confidence in international law is at present quite fragile. So today is about celebrating a landmark agreement. It is also about reflecting on what it tells us about continuing relevance, resilience and the future of international law in an increasingly uncertain world. To do that, it's over to some amazing experts. So joining us today is Professor Donald Rothwell, Professor of International Law at the Australian National University and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Law. He's a leading expert in law of the sea and polar law and has authored over 30 books, including the latest edition of the International Law of the Sea, which I have sitting on my table. Professor Rothwell has advised organisations including UNEP and the Australian Government, and is a frequent commentator featured by major outlets including the BBC, CNN and the New York Times. And we're delighted to welcome you back to this Ocean Knowledge series event. Don, thank you for being here. We're also joined by Dr. Sarah Lothian, Associate Professor and Academic Barrister at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, or ANCORS, at the University of Wollongong. With over a decade in legal practice and a PhD PhD from the University of Sydney. She is an expert in international law of the sea and marine biodiversity. Her 2023 book on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction is a leading work in the field, reflecting her focus on ocean governance and the conservation and sustainable use of marine resources. With that, I will hand over to Lucy Buxton, Director of Ocean Decade Australia. Thanks, Lucy. Sorry, Lucy, you are on mute.
Oh, thanks, Jazz. Thank you for those introductions and welcome everyone to the webinar. We'd like to start this webinar before we get into the facilitated Q&A with some opening remarks. So I invite Don, please.
Thanks, Lucy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you today. And can I just commence with acknowledging the work of Ocean Decade Australia in putting together this forum and their ongoing commitment to advocacy for the oceans. My pre-presentation today takes three forms. First, I'm just going to start thinking about the development of the law of the sea. And when Sarah and I teach law of the sea to our students, we inevitably start with the work of Hugo Grotius, a Dutch scholar whose work in the 1600s was incredibly influential with respect to the law of the sea, but particularly because Grotius advocated the principle of the freedom of the seas. And that notion of the freedom of the seas has really stayed with us over the centuries and is still a dominant principle that we reflect upon in 2026. Moving forward to more recent times, we began to see changes in the way in which we considered the oceans, principally as a result of the proclamation by President Truman of the United States in 1945, when the United States unilaterally proclaimed a continental shelf. But that claim was readily accepted by many states around the world, and that set in train a process for the more modern and contemporary development of the modern law of the sea, first through the conclusion of the four 1958 conventions adopted in Geneva, which dealt with the high seas, the continental shelf, the territorial sea, and also some aspects of fisheries, but then culminated really in the so-called Constitution of the Oceans adopted in 1982, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that convention emphasizes once again the importance of freedoms, but particularly the freedoms of the high seas. And to a degree, what we're talking about today is reflecting upon how those freedoms still sit within the contemporary international legal framework. Nevertheless, whilst that Constitution of the Oceans reflected in the Law of the Sea Convention was an absolutely outstanding achievement for its time, and it remains so to this day, it was acknowledged that back in 1982 there were gaps in that regulatory regime. For example, the convention doesn't comprehensively deal with questions concerning military activities. It didn't deal with high seas fishing activities. It had a framework for marine environmental protection, but that wasn't particularly detailed. It didn't deal with marine genetic resources, and it certainly didn't deal with the phenomena of uncrewed vessels at sea. So what's really occurred in the interim period has been gap filling, if you like. And the most important gap that was initially filled was the whole question of high seas fish stocks, straddling stocks, migratory species. And we saw that concluded in a 1995 agreement, commonly called the Fish Stocks Agreement. And then the agreement that we're talking about today, concluded in 2023, is the next step in that particular process. So what we've seen then is an expansion of the legal framework with respect to the law of the sea over a period of time, and it may well be that in the future we'll see more efforts to further expand upon that framework. So the way to visualize the BBNJ agreement adopted in 2023 is that it is a major last piece in the jigsaw puzzle in terms of oceans governance. And that's because it dealt with this area of the high seas, the water column of the high seas, the marine environment of the high seas that wasn't adequately addressed in the provisions of the 1982 convention. So as a supplementary instrument, to the 1982 convention, it fills a significant gap, but it doesn't seek to fundamentally disturb the core foundations of the law of the sea, as I've outlined for you. But what it does do is seek to comprehensively address the question of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction in the various forms and the guises that it's considered in the agreement itself. Most importantly, this is not a high seas treaty, and indeed there may well be some confusion about the fact that the legislation that's been passing through the Parliament is called the High Seas Biodiversity Act when it's proclaimed. You'll also see references to the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty or indeed a High Seas Treaty. We need to be very cautious about that because this instrument doesn't really in any way seek to comprehensively deal with the regime of the high seas. But as both Sarah and I will be advocating, it deals with the distinctive question of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And so to that end, and consistent with my analogy of it being a piece in the jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't really seek to disturb the existing legal frameworks that sit otherwise around that jigsaw puzzle in terms of oceans governance, so to speak. So to that end, it doesn't really seek to directly interfere or engage with the regime for deep seabed mining under Part 11 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which is predominantly overseen by the International Seabed Authority, consistently with the framework provisions of the convention. It doesn't disturb, for example, the Antarctic Treaty System and the associated Convention on Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And that's a critical issue for Australia, given Australia's long-standing engagement and support and core issues that Australia has in terms of the stability and security of Antarctic governance, but especially in terms of the Southern Ocean. It doesn't deal with the issue of whaling, and it also doesn't seek to disturb other well-established and existing marine environmental instruments. And I guess that will be one of the interesting questions that will emerge in terms of how these various instruments will ultimately begin to interact with each other and not disturb and disrupt well-established existing international mechanisms. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge, given some of the comments I make in a range of fora, that this is a very testing time for international law. But Australia's track record with respect to international law, certainly since the UN Charter era in 1945, is a particularly proud one. Australia strongly supports the international legal framework, not only established under the UN Charter, but through institutions such as the International Court of Justice. Australia's had 3 judges elected to the ICJ, and Judge Hilary Charlesworth, formerly of the Australian National University, is a permanent judge on the International Court at the moment. And of course, Australia has also been a strong supporter of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And indeed, just in Canberra last week, Australia indicated its ongoing support for international law with the adoption of a free trade agreement with the European Union. Australia, to that end, has also been a very strong supporter of all of those multiple law of the sea instruments that I've been referring to, and has also been actively engaged in the peaceful resolution of international disputes through frameworks established under the Law of the Sea Convention, through the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and ultimately, of course, sought to resolve its maritime boundaries via reconciliation with Timor-Leste. And this current government, it needs to be acknowledged, constantly references the law of the sea. I can't recall a government which has done so to such an extent previously, especially in the context of matters in our region and especially in the South China Sea. So to that end, Australia is a strong supporter of international law, but especially the Law of the Sea Convention. And I look forward to discussion and debate on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, for that extraordinary scene setting. And as you said, what an incredible jigsaw of different conventions and pieces of the puzzle here, and how very exciting that this piece is fitting into that, as you've described, specifically around the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. So with that context having been described to us, Sarah, I'd love to pass to you. Many people are keen to understand what the BBNJ agreement actually covers. So perhaps you could talk to us a little bit more detail about that framework, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jazz and Lucy. And thank you for inviting me to take part in such an important webinar, particularly at this pivotal time for Australia. It's an absolute honour to be here with Don. And Don, thank you very much for setting the scene on the origins and purpose of the BBNJ Agreement. And as Lucy mentioned, I thought I would use my time to discuss what the BBNJ Agreement actually covers in terms of content and how it fits within the existing ocean governance framework. So as Don mentioned, geographically, the BBNJ Agreement will only apply to marine areas beyond national jurisdiction, which comprise those two distinct maritime zones. The high seas, which encompass the water column beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and the international deep seabed area, which comprises the seabed, ocean floor, and subsoil beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. So we're talking about beyond the continental shelf. Now that's its geographical scope, but what about its material scope or subject matter? The overriding objective of the BBNJ Agreement is to ensure the long-term conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction through the effective implementation of relevant provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention, or UNCLOS, and by furthering international cooperation and coordination. Now, no definition is provided for the term marine biodiversity in the agreement, but it can be understood as encompassing the variability of marine life in all of its forms, levels, and combinations, including species, genetic, and ecosystem diversity. So in effect, the BBNJ Agreement seeks to tackle one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century, managing our deep ocean environment, including its ecosystems and resources, in a sustainable way to prevent long-term decline, but also to meet the needs of present and future generations. Now, the BBNJ Agreement itself is structured around a package deal of four main elements or pillars. First, we have marine genetic resources, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. Secondly, we have measures such as area-based management tools, including high seas marine protected areas. Third, we have environmental impact assessments. And lastly, my personal favourite is capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. So I thought I would briefly unpack each in turn, starting with that first pillar, which is all about how we should access and share benefits derived from marine genetic resources. So in recent decades, the genomic diversity of the marine realm has really started to attract increasing scientific and commercial attention, particularly from the research and development sector. Now, the deep sea remains the least known ecosystem on Earth, so it really does represent an untapped source of new materials, compounds, and organisms. However, that growing appreciation for and use of marine genetic resources really started to highlight gaps and limitations in the UNCLOS framework. So while marine genetic resources within national waters are accessed subject to UNCLOS, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and other international provisions, access to marine genetic resources beyond national jurisdiction has been completely open, with no formal benefit sharing mechanism in place, which has meant there's been no obligation on researchers or bioprospectors to share data, knowledge, and benefits with the rest of the international community. So it was really important to devise a fair and equitable access and benefit sharing regime. Part 2 of the BBNJ Agreement now lays out an elaborate access regime, which is very much based on notification. So state parties will need to provide to the clearinghouse mechanism established under the agreement notifications both prior to and post collection of marine genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction. They'll also need to give notifications to the clearinghouse upon the subsequent utilisation or commercialisation of those resources. Now, as a genetic resource can be passed on to multiple users and change its nature along the research and development chain, the assignment of what we've called the standardized BBNJ batch identifier through the notification system will provide us with a means to track and trace subsequent uses and locations of marine genetic resources, including in databases and repositories around the world. Now, along with access considerations, BBNJ negotiators had to really wrestle with some complex questions on benefit sharing. So the BBNJ agreement provides for the fair and equitable sharing of both monetary and non-monetary benefits derived from marine genetic resources. So some examples of non-monetary benefits include access to samples and sample collections, as well as open access to scientific data and capacity building. Capacity building in this context also includes increased technical and scientific cooperation, as well as partnership opportunities for scientists and researchers to take part in research projects involving marine genetic resources. Monetary benefits will also need to be shared fairly and equitably, but the exact modalities are still to be determined and will be determined at a later date by the Conference of the Parties. However, in the meantime, developed state parties will be required to make annual contributions to the special fund established under the BBNJ agreement, corresponding to 50% of their assessed contribution to the budget adopted by the Conference of the Parties. So this really provides a guaranteed source of revenue from the outset and really sets the BBNJ agreement apart from other multilateral environmental agreements. Turning now to the second pillar, which concerns measures such as area-based management tools. So Part 3 of the BBNJ agreement now lays out a process for the identification, designation, implementation, and review of area-based management tools. Now, one of the main objectives of Part 3 is to conserve and sustainably use priority protection areas through the establishment of ecologically representative and well-connected networks of high seas marine protected areas. And this is really one of the centerpieces of the BBNJ agreement and is very well aligned with the 30 by 30 target of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Under the BBNJ agreement, state parties will now be able to submit proposals for the establishment of area-based management tools, either individually or collectively. That proposal will then undergo a rigorous consultation and assessment process, and the Conference of the Parties will be the ultimate decision-making body. Decisions will need to be taken by consensus, but in the event consensus is not reached, by vote requiring a 3/4 majority of parties present and voting. Now, another important area-based management tool, environmental impact assessment, is the third pillar of the BBNJ agreement. So Article 206 of UNCLOS already imposes a general obligation on states to assess the potential effects of activities under their jurisdiction or control that may cause substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment. However, as this obligation has been very poorly implemented, the development of the BBNJ agreement really offered the opportunity to operationalise Article 206 by providing a recipe for when and how to properly conduct an impact assessment in areas beyond national jurisdiction. A state party will be responsible for deciding that an environmental impact assessment is required and ensuring that one is carried out in accordance with the agreement's terms prior to engaging in or authorising an activity to proceed. The BBNJ agreement also sets out a threshold criteria that will be used to trigger the screening of an activity to determine if it requires an impact assessment. So when a planned activity may have more than a minor or transitory effect on the marine environment, or the effects of the activity are unknown or poorly understood, the state party with jurisdiction or control over that activity will need to conduct a screening. If that screening uncovers that the activity may cause substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment, then an impact assessment will be required. Significantly, an impact assessment under the BBNJ agreement must also consider cumulative impacts, including the consequences of climate change. So I'm conscious of time, so I won't spend too long on the last pillar of the package deal, even though it is my favourite, which is capacity building and technology transfer. Suffice to say, the provisions of the BBNJ agreement attempt to strengthen Part 14 of UNCLOS, which remains one of the most underutilised parts of the Convention. The BBNJ agreement recognises capacity building and the development and transfer of marine technology as a critical cross-cutting element, and it will be crucial to support states in achieving the objectives of the instrument, but will also be indispensable to the implementation of the other three pillars. Under the BBNJ agreement, state parties will be required to cooperate either directly or through relevant instruments, frameworks, or bodies to assist parties, particularly developing states, in achieving the objectives of the instrument through capacity building and the development and transfer of marine science and technology. The agreement sets out the modalities for how this capacity building and technology transfer is to take place, but also gives us a useful list of capacity building and technology transfer activities and initiatives. Now, as the newest addition to the Ocean Governance Framework, the BBNJ Agreement enters an already crowded institutional landscape. Under the UNCLOS umbrella, areas beyond national jurisdiction are governed, regulated, and/or managed by a patchwork of governance organisations and bodies, each with their own mandates and priorities. So as Don mentioned, for example, we have deep seabed mining overseen by the International Seabed Authority. We have shipping and the dumping of waste regulated through conventions adopted under the International Maritime Organization. And of course, fishing addressed at the global level by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and complemented by regional fisheries management organizations. We also have a number of sectorial and regional instruments and frameworks. Now, the purpose of the BBNJ agreement is not to deal with ocean governance matters afresh. Article 5 actually requires the instrument to be interpreted and applied in a manner that does not undermine relevant instruments, frameworks, and bodies. The intention behind this proviso is to safeguard against the BBNJ agreement attempting to encroach on matters that already fall within the competence of existing bodies and would therefore have the effect of undermining their respective legal mandates. So in other words, the role of the BBNJ agreement is not to supersede or dictate actions to existing international resource and environmental governance regimes. Instead, it's to actively engage and work with them in pursuing the objectives of the instrument. And in that respect, the BBNJ agreement is highly unusual, as its success will ultimately depend not only on the implementation by states, but also by relevant instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And the BBNJ agreement incorporates cooperative tools and mechanisms, really in an effort to develop a more harmonised, coordinated approach to the protection of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And I think I'll stop there. Jazz, Lucy, and Don both can testify that it's dangerous giving me time on BBNJ. So I hope I've stuck to time, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You've outlined those pillars absolutely wonderfully, and I think given a really fantastic description to the audience of the breadth and depth that the agreement covers, from use and equitable benefits through to protection mechanisms, the impact assessment. It's certainly extraordinarily broad, and we acknowledge the incredible work of the negotiating teams and our national bodies in achieving what's been able to be done to date. So we're now going to move into the Q&A section of this webinar, and just reminding the audience that you can put in your questions in the Q&A channel, and please feel free to ask questions. As I'll reiterate what Jazz said in the opening comments, anything too specific or too commercial we may not get to on this call with Don and Sarah, but of course happy to see what is coming through. So I'll just get the ball rolling. And Don, I'd love to come back to you. You've both outlined this extraordinary landscape, and Sarah, I think you called it a rather crowded landscape at times, but the safeguard mechanisms that are in place to make sure that the BBNJ agreement dovetails with many of those other mechanisms and laws, Don, that you gave in your scene setting. So, Don, do you see this as a kind of natural evolution and the agreement coming in now in the operating environment that we're working in? And how do you see the agreement now strengthening the effectiveness of that international maritime law landscape that you outlined?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one of the remarkable aspects of the Law of the Sea Convention in 1982 was that Part 12 of the convention was dedicated to addressing the marine environment. That at the time was really quite exceptional. But that aspect of the Law of the Sea Convention came prior to the Rio Conference, which resulted in the negotiation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention, and everything that's followed since then. So whilst the Law of the Sea Convention provided a framework to deal with the marine environment, particularly the marine environment as it relates to that area within national jurisdiction, it was the high seas area beyond national jurisdiction that was really the weak link, so to speak, in terms of how that legal framework was comprehensive. So that's why I said, to a degree, the BBNJ is the additional piece in the jigsaw puzzle. So it completes the comprehensive nature and scope of the Constitution of the Oceans, as it's been called, but it also does reflect an evolution because, as Sarah outlined, the agreement addresses issues that weren't really contemplated or properly understood back in the 1970s, and we need to understand that the Law of the Sea Convention was predominantly negotiated during the 1970s. So we really have a 21st century version of oceans governance as it principally relates to this area of areas beyond national jurisdiction.
And Sarah, with that in mind, and I think that you outlined this in regards to the opportunity for cooperation, and there is a lot of international cooperation following on from Don's comments now that we're looking at our wider biological climate and capacity needs. Could you maybe give your thoughts around what are the benefits for Australia and the wider Indo-Pacific region within regards to the BBNJ agreement?
Thanks so much. It's a great question, and obviously Australia has played a pivotal role. Actually, at the moment, we are co-chair of the Preparatory Commission, which is taking place in New York as we speak. They're in the second week now of that process, and that process is taking place to try and put in the nuts and bolts that we'll need moving forward for the operationalization of the BBNJ agreement. It's a very elaborate treaty. It's got one of the most sophisticated institutional arrangements I've ever seen. So there is still a lot of work to be done. But in terms of the benefits for Australia, it obviously opens the door for us to partner with countries around the region, particularly when it comes to submitting proposals for marine protected areas in the high seas, for example. I know that there's a lot of work already being done in that space in terms of identifying that first generation of high seas marine protected areas, which is very exciting. But also I think that, as I mentioned in my presentation, for me, the most exciting part of the BBNJ agreement is the capacity building and technology transfer provisions, because I think that really opens the door for Australia to form a really strong network of regional capacity building partners, and also engage in a lot of opportunities to heighten or enhance scientific cooperation, particularly within our region, and partnering with countries that may not have the sophisticated technologies that are required to go out there and sample marine genetic resources in situ in their natural environment. So I think that that's where Australia could play a really leading role.
And Lucy, perhaps if I can just build on Sarah's comments there, I think that we need to see this in the context of also other developments with respect to the law of the sea, and especially the way in which Pacific Island communities and peoples from small island states have been seeking to advance a greater understanding of the impacts of climate change with respect to the law of the sea at a geopolitical and regional political level. Of course, that's been a key issue for the Albanese government over the last few years. So the entry into force of the BBNJ agreement, which Indigenous peoples and peoples from a range of small island states, and principally from the global south, invested enormous diplomatic efforts and energy in terms of the conclusion of this agreement. This really provides Australia, as one of the major states in our region, to play a really leading role in terms of moving forward that, especially with our Pacific partners.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And I think with the increasing geopolitical changes that we've been observing certainly this year, I think that there is certainly a strengthened conversation at the moment with regards to capacity building and regional cooperation. So very interesting to see how this might support that. So with that in mind, cooperation is a key theme throughout the BBNJ agreement, as you have both spoken to, but those could you maybe, Sarah, elaborate on some of the specific tools or mechanisms that are in the instrument that could, and the potential challenges in making those tools work effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lucy. So one of the benefits that we've seen with the BBNJ agreement is the need to engage with all relevant stakeholders. So when it comes to considering proposals for high seas marine protected areas, or even in respect to the environmental impact assessment process, it's going to be necessary to collaborate and cooperate with a wide range of stakeholders so that everyone has their say. So the consultation process itself still needs to be worked out. This is one of the things that will be decided upon by the Conference of the Parties. But a lot of work has been invested during the preparatory commission process in trying to work out how the nuts and bolts of that consultation process, which will oftentimes be overseen by the Secretariat of the BBNJ agreement, will actually play out in practice. I think one of the most exciting developments too is the clearinghouse mechanism. So the clearinghouse mechanism has been tasked with a number of important functions, one of which is the matchmaking function. So it will be used essentially to try and match those who have capacity building needs with those that are able to provide it. And I think that's a really important function. But it's also going to be in effect once it's in operation, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but the hope is that it will be a one-stop shop where we can bring together information, data about marine biodiversity, which is currently scattered all around different clearinghouse mechanisms, different databases around the world. Hopefully the clearinghouse will be able to provide that important function, which I think will also foster international cooperation in that sphere as well.
Yes, you make an excellent point, and certainly sharing knowledge, data, and information from across both scientific, Indigenous and commercial entities is going to be very important in achieving the high ambition that we have, not just nationally under agreements such as 30 by 30, but also with regards to that regional capacity building that you've both touched on. So, Don, without asking you to be too specific, are you able to give maybe a feeling for how the BBNJ agreement may change the activities or considerations for different users, such as marine research or emerging industries that are operating in the high seas?
Well, perhaps most importantly, it provides much greater certainty in terms of a legal framework that, as both of us have identified, really didn't exist previously, especially in terms of a secure legal framework to be able to move forward to engage in exploration and commercialization of marine genetic resources, for example. But that also results in the imperative for countries like Australia, who are becoming a party to the BBNJ agreement, to, of course, create their own national legal frameworks. And to a degree, that's really the whole point of the legislation that's been passed through the Parliament. So we will have, as a result of this, both secure, stable national legal frameworks for those countries who choose to adopt those measures. And Australia has a fairly good gold standard of making sure that before it ratifies any treaty, it has a comprehensive legal framework. and that national legal framework will dovetail within the international legal framework. So those are some of the critical issues, because if you go back through the work that Sarah and I have done over a number of decades looking at scholarship in this area, everyone, of course, was bemoaning that there was effectively a legal vacuum in terms of that particular space.
Thank you. And we've just received a question encouraging others to put your questions into the Q&A. But one question that has come through is, given that some big nation states are not signatories to the law of the sea, how do you see the BBNJ agreement being enforced in those areas?
Yeah, do you want me to take it first, Don?
Go ahead.
Enforcement was always the elephant in the room of the BBNJ negotiations, and the term itself only appears once in the agreement itself. I believe that one of the most significant challenges moving forward, and I think this is actually circling back to a question that you raised earlier, Lucy, we'll be trying to work out how we are going to monitor, control, and carry out surveillance of high seas marine protected areas. In other words, how do we ensure compliance and enforcement? And so I think that's a key aspect that I think also needs to be looked at moving forward, in terms of, it's very hard for us to position someone outside of areas beyond national jurisdiction in order to, surveil that particular marine protected area 24 hours a day. We know how difficult it is even to do that within our exclusive economic zone. So we're going to need to harness, and this is where, private industries and the private sector can really come on board as well, is harness technologies such as, vessel monitoring systems, satellite data, things like that, to assist us in monitoring marine protected areas. Yes, there is some big names that have still not signed on or ratified the big BBNJ agreement. Obviously, it will only be legally binding on those states that do sign up and ratify to it. Don, I might hand over to you there, because you might have some thoughts on that, and in terms of the big players that are yet to come on board.
Yeah, well, look, I guess I'd make two comments. The first is that we need to be really cautious about being too judgmental at this relatively early phase, because the agreement has only really entered into force in the last few months. And as is often the case with these large multilateral instruments, the instrument meets the threshold for entry into force. That then creates a momentum for others to join in. So I think in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time, we might actually have a much better sense in terms of the core group of states who are going to be committed to being a part of this agreement. But as has been identified by Sarah, we already have institutional processes underway, and that itself will act as an incentive for other states to become parties. I think the bigger issue that we have, though, generally at the moment, is unfortunately the state of the law of the sea. And to that end, it just has to be acknowledged that the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. And whilst the United States has consistently argued that it views the convention as part of customary international law and actively seeks to assert many of the rights that exist under the Law of the Sea Convention, such as the freedom of navigation, where there's virtually no difference at all between the Australian position and the US position on those matters. I think from my perspective, my great concern at the moment is the US position with respect to deep seabed mining. President Trump issued a presidential executive order last year, which in theory will allow for the United States to license deep seabed mining to take place during this particular administration. That itself would significantly undermine one of the core aspects of the Law of the Sea Convention, and indeed would have implications for the security of biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. And we've got some other big issues at the moment which need to be acknowledged.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate that. And this will be the last question to you, because I know you have another engagement that you need to go to shortly. But we've actually just received a question on deep sea mining, so perhaps we can squeeze this one in. We do get asked a lot about deep seabed mining, and I was wondering, given your previous comments, whether you have any insights on how the BBNJ agreement will dovetail with the ongoing work with the International Seabed Authority.
Yeah, I'll let Sarah talk about the technicalities of that, but the big picture is that, as I said, the core objective here was not to interfere with the Part 11 regime that sits within the Law of the Sea Convention, which actually facilitates deep seabed mining. But at the moment, as things stand, we effectively have a de facto moratorium on deep seabed mining because, notwithstanding the work of the International Seabed Authority and seeing us literally at the brink of deep seabed mining commencing as regulated under the frameworks of the Law of the Sea Convention, we don't have any activity occurring at the moment. But that could change very quickly, consistently with Part 11 International Seabed Authority frameworks. But of course, the key issue is this question of interaction, which I'll let Sarah pick up on the technical question about the fact that whilst we have a mechanism under which deep seabed mining could literally occur, and we have provisions there which deal with environmental issues, the disturbance of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction as it sits on the seabed is a critical issue that states but also non-governmental organisations are quite concerned about. And of course, there's a high level of scientific uncertainty about the impact of that. But of course, that will also vary from area to area of the deep seabed. And so there's a whole series of variables that exist in this area.
Thank you. Sarah, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so Don's spot on. So BBNJ and ISA will intersect on a number of occasions. Obviously, the International Seabed Authority has their own spatial management tools that they've set up. So they use areas of particular environmental interest, and they've set up, I think we're up to nearly 11 or 13, don't quote me on that, in terms of the Clarion-Clipperton zone in particular, which is highly biodiverse, but also even the environmental impact assessments. So where I think BBNJ could be highly influential is obviously the International Seabed Authority is in the process of drafting exploitation regulations. Now, one of the provisions under the BBNJ agreement is if there is already a regime that has an environmental impact assessment process, then you can say that you've gone through that process under them. But it's going to be whether that process is equivalent to what the BBNJ agreement now provides. And this is where this sort of question is, does the BBNJ agreement now provide the gold standard in terms of environmental impact assessment? So it may have a very influential, effect on how things are addressed under the International Seabed Authority. Now, they are also considered a relevant instrument framework and body. So they will be invited into the fold in terms of the consultations that will need to take place, because we've also got that not undermine proviso. So we have to be very careful not to encroach upon the legal mandate of the International Seabed Authority at the same time. So it's going to be a delicate process, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds. But I do hope, and what I'm sensing from the Preparatory Commission is that there is an appetite for these existing bodies to all start to come together, because that was one of the main, I would say, the Achilles heel of the existing framework, was that everybody was working in very siloed operations. Yes, they were putting in place some, measures that could protect BBNJ, but it was never their primary focus. Now the BBNJ agreement has that core focus, and we can work together to try and make it more streamlined, more coordinated.
Thank you, Sarah. Noting time, Don, I would like to thank you very much for your attendance. Sarah, I think you can stay on for just a couple more minutes. Thank you, Don. We really appreciate it.
Bye.
Sarah, thank you. So just one last question, I think, before we go into the wrap up is another question from online, which is, do you think that the BBNJ agreement will have any legal influence over any aspects of how coastal states manage ocean within their national jurisdiction, given that they are often big ocean states and that interplay there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, it's a very good question, because obviously there's the interconnectivity between national waters and international waters. I do think that the BBNJ agreement may not only influence existing instruments, frameworks, and bodies, but it will force states to look at their own environmental impact assessment process. For example, even though I said from the outset that BBNJ is limited geographically to areas beyond national jurisdiction, one thing that states, coastal states in particular, need to keep in mind is that if there's any activities that are taking place within national waters that may have an impact on areas beyond national jurisdiction, those states then need to undertake an environmental impact assessment, either in accordance with the BBNJ agreement or in accordance with their national process. So it might actually force a lot of coastal states who may have not put in place an environmental impact assessment process to say, oh, hold on a minute, we want to take control over anything that's going on in our national waters, to actually start that process. So I think it might have a very positive effect in that sphere as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And just leading on from that, there is a great one here about with regards to genetic resources and the use of the clearinghouse mechanism. The question is around submitting information into that mechanism and whether that's only applicable where there's the intention to identify resources for commercial purposes. For example, does it apply to baseline survey work where water quality or sediment sampling or indeed the biological sampling might be the purpose of that, of retrieving that genetic material for non-commercial use?
Yeah, really interesting. It will cover that, something like that. So if you're going to go out there on a research cruise and there is an intention to sample marine genetic resources, and that term is defined under the BBNJ agreement, effectively it encompasses anything that has DNA, then you will need to file that prior notification. Now, states, obviously, each state, it's at their discretion how they choose to do that. Some states may go down an authorization regime where they want anyone that's going to undertake those activities to let them know so that then the state can pass that information on to the clearinghouse mechanism. It will be up to each individual state how they implement this at a domestic level. But it is very important that we start raising awareness of the fact that if you are going out there on a research cruise, whether it's for commercial purposes or otherwise, you will need to give that notification to the clearinghouse, because that notification will automatically prompt, sounds very good, doesn't it? It will automatically prompt that generation of the BBNJ standardized batch identifier. And that will then be attached to that notification, but that collection event itself. So anything that's been collected as part of that event will then fall under that batch identifier. Because sometimes when we go out there, we don't necessarily know whether we're going to sample something that we may commercialize later on. It may not be the case, but we wanted to make sure that we could track and trace that. And so you can think of that BBNJ standardized batch identifier as like a little passport that marine genetic resource will have throughout its life, so that we can monitor its various uses and locations. Because if I could end with this, Lucy, there was a lot of attention during the BBNJ negotiations on the monetary benefits from marine genetic resources. That is high. It's going to take 15 to 20 years to actually commercialize a product. And the success rate, if I'm not mistaken, is 0.001%. I believe the more tangible gains long-term will be in the non-monetary benefits to be derived from marine genetic resources. And that's through advancing our understanding of the marine environment and what we actually have out there. As I mentioned, it remains the least known ecosystem on Earth. So there's a lot still to uncover. But yes, I hope that helps to answer that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think we will make this the last question before wrap up, but just a note to everyone online, thank you for the fantastic questions, and those that we were not able to answer in this live webinar, we'll work with Don and Sarah to follow up with them and seek the answers, and we will send those out in a communication follow up with the recording of the webinar. So thank you very much, everyone. So Sarah, the final question I'd just like to get to is that aspect that we spoke to earlier on in the webinar around the cumulative impacts and the time, the place that we're living in right now. So with regards to the EIA process, are you able to expand a little bit more about how cumulative impacts such as climate change will be taken into account with that when meeting that EIA threshold for the BBNJ?
Yes. So basically, when you're carrying out an environmental impact assessment, it's not only the impacts that that particular activity will have on the marine environment, but you need to take into account other uses that are going on around that particular activity, because they're one of the drawbacks with Article 206 of UNCLOS was it didn't take into account cumulative impacts. And we now know that there's so many activities and uses of the oceans going on that we needed to put in place something that would take into account all of those various impacts, including climate change. And the BBNJ agreement specifically mentions ocean acidification as one in particular. So it is something that states will need to be alive to. They can't just take an activity or sector-based approach to an environmental impact assessment. They do need to look more holistically at what is going on in that particular environment where the activity is going to take place.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think that also speaks to many things that you've touched, Don, and you have touched on in this call with regards to data and those mechanisms in place. I love that idea of the passport. That was a wonderful analogy, but also the opportunity for collaboration, both regionally, but also within the users and beneficiaries in order to really start building out that picture of shared use, shared impact, and how there can be greater opportunity for cooperation in this space. Wonderful. Well, I would like to wrap up there and thank you, Sarah, so much for your absolutely fantastic outline and giving us such wonderful examples of how and what the BBNJ is covers. And of course, we do acknowledge that there is now work to do with regards to implementation and operationalization of that. So with that in mind, I might hand over to Jazz to speak a little bit about our next webinar. And thank you, Jazz.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Don and Sarah, for an insightful and really engaging discussion. That depth of expertise from the broader foundations of international law through to the practical and emerging challenges of ocean governance and biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction has really helped bring the significance of the BBNJ into sharp focus. And we're really grateful for the clarity in what is a very complex and evolving area. So thank you for that. I know that everyone online will be helping me with some applause there. As Sarah mentioned, the third session of the BBNJ Preparatory Commission, or PrepCom3, is on right now in New York at UN headquarters, where states are meeting to discuss, finalise the institutional and operational details of the BBNJ Agreement, essentially building the architecture that will allow the treaty to work once the first conference of the parties is convened. So we know Australian government officials are there right now. As Lucy mentioned, there will be a follow-up webinar to this one with Australian government representatives available to talk about the legislation that passed just yesterday, and I do have a copy of the bill here, and next steps towards Australia's ratification. We're really delighted by the interest in the legislative process and the policy that underpins ocean governance, use and oversight. And as you might appreciate, this is a key aspect of ODA's mission, which is to share knowledge and expertise from across our network. In preparation for that next webinar, we encourage you to use the QR code that's on the screen right now and put questions through there so that we can have a really efficient and useful presentation and conversation. That will be, the timing still to be worked out. We need our government officials to come home, and as you can appreciate, with everything just passing yesterday, there's a bit of work to do now. But thank you again to everyone for joining us. This recording will be posted to all who registered and to our social channels as well. Thank you and goodbye.